All right, here's the second lesson of Chapter 11, Jacksonian Democracy. In specific here, this is about conflicts over land and with Native Americans. Two essential questions. The first one will be primarily about our primary documents we're going to look at in class after we've gone through this videocast and quizzed on it. Why did people in the 1830s support Indian removal, and how does Andrew Jackson's presidency affect Native Americans? And this cartoon will be kind of an interesting one. We'll kind of take a look at this. Consider how he is pictured here and how Native Americans are pictured here, and the relationship that is being expressed in this particular video. The nation is expanding significantly, rapidly. Again, this is the age of transportation revolution, canals, roads into the west, and steamboat travel. Population is growing very quickly. Land gobbling is happening very quickly in both sections of the country, cotton in the south, and crops and every other type of farming you can think of in the north, and land is needed. And there are 5 civilized tribes that are established in and have been in the south for a while, and have been in many cases living in and amongst whites in white society. Thus the term and the name 5 civilized tribes. The Chickasaw, the Natchez, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creeks, Echota, and Temucas are a few of them, but the 5 primary ones that we're taking a look at here would be these in the 5 civilized tribes. And they're dressing like whites, they are farming like white people, and they're really trying to fit in. They have their own farming societies, and in many cases some of these farmers are more successful than white farmers, which causes some jealousy. And they're really trying to save themselves and their culture by assimilating. And assimilation was something that George Washington and some of the early leaders of the early government tried to do, get them to live more like whites and to try and relieve the Native American issue, problem, as it was phrased at that time, to be solved in that manner. The Cherokee, unlike other Native Americans, actually also had their own alphabet in written language. But the pressure and the demand for land, as we know with cotton, especially down here in the south, as you saw on the map, is something that's going to drive them out. And our Mr. Andrew Jackson is going to be very aggressive in relocating them. And we'll take a look at that more with some documents and such later, specifically what he says. But the difference in things here, and what we need to know a little bit here is, and review here a little bit, is geography. Geography east and west of the Mississippi is very different. West of the Mississippi, very few Americans really were concerned about this particular land in terms of wanting to own it. As time goes on and as the population reaches the Mississippi River, it's very sparsely settled. It's also very limited in trees. It also is very limited in terms of water, and the ground and the soil there is tougher than it is in the east, and it's more difficult to farm. And that 100th meridian pretty much marks a point at which the rainfall significantly changes, and farming methods back here don't translate to here. It's not a desert, but it's arid, and it's almost desert-like compared to what people are used to back in this section of the country. So this particular Louisiana Purchase that most of this tends to comprise here up in this area is considered to be maybe an option for the Native American issue and the Native American problem. And Thomas Jefferson actually thought that this would be a purchase that would assist in that, and Native Americans could be relocated to this other side, and then thus less conflict. But it's not necessarily going to completely turn out that way. And now what we're going to see with President Jackson is that he's pretty much always going to side with the settlers, white Americans, in terms of issues with land and space. Native Americans, he had actually some Native American allies in the War of 1812 that actually fought with him. Ironically, one of those Native American allied chiefs is going to be one of the ones who are going to be relocated. But he also fought against Native Americans. If you recall, he was sent down there by President Monroe to deal with some Seminole raids down in Florida on the Florida-Georgia-Alabama border, and he is also going to send out some messages to deal with Native Americans where there's problems, and send out military forces to deal with Native American problems elsewhere in the country as well. But the primary issue here is space and land. We'll look at this more specifically in his words and his primary documents from his speech. But it, by and large, says he says in his inaugural address that he intends to move Native Americans to the Great Plains area. But we'll take a look at some of the factors as to why, as well as other surprising sources and why they say this should also happen as well. Back to our essential question. The Indian Removal Act is going to be passed in 1834, and it basically is going to encourage Native Americans to move into Indian territory with some payment, and this will be practice for pretty much most of American government history, in which there's payment or some sort of system of compensation for Native Americans. Not that it's fair, not that it even happens or the payment actually occurs, because it doesn't in many cases. And as the treaties and the agreements are going to be signed later on, the Native Americans won't necessarily always understand what they're signing. But he basically Jackson sends officials out to make treaties with Native Americans, and most Native Americans felt very forced to accept it, as if there was no option, and there really wasn't an option here. But this Indian Removal Act is going to establish Indian territory, and this is basically, if you look at the shape here, present-day state of Oklahoma. And it provided for a section of that territory established by and mapped out by Congress for each of the many the main civilized tribes and other Native Americans in the southeast of the United States, and including also, of course, some of the Seminoles are going to have a spot here, as you can see right there. And this Indian Removal Act is passed in 1834, creating this territory. So this is the last year of Andrew Jackson's second term of office, and he is basically setting the groundwork for this relocation to happen. They're encouraged to leave with payment, but they have a particular tribe, the Cherokee, that do not want to leave and move. There should be another 0 right there, about 17,000 members within that nation alone. And they wish to remain exactly where they're at. And they had experienced, the Native Americans in the South here had experienced, in particular the state of Georgia, had experienced land being taken from them before. There were treaties established to protect their land, in particular this place of Georgia, in the state of Georgia. All of a sudden, a little thing called gold was discovered, and all of a sudden some of the land was starting to be taken away. And this onslaught happens at the state level also. And so it actually goes to court, and there's an actual Native American by the name of Samuel Worcester, who's a missionary, and he's out there defying basically what Georgia is trying to do, and basically through peaceful means of protest and using the legal system, which is a very civilized thing to do. And he's arrested several times, and a team of lawyers bring a lawsuit for him through the system, and it eventually gets to the Supreme Court. And Chief Justice John Marshall is the Supreme Court Chief Justice, and despite the fact that Native Americans are going to lose out here in the end, he actually sides with the Native Americans and looks at the Constitution and says that Georgia is, as a state, here's another theme we talked about before, federal government limiting the power of the states, Georgia had no right to interfere with the Cherokee, and that only the federal government had the power to make decisions in Cherokee matters. One, either make treaties with the Native Americans. They are considered a foreign nation. The federal government makes treaties with foreign nations, and the president negotiates them. Of course, Congress approves them. And by doing this, Georgia and any other state would be overstepping its grounds. And so they actually rule for Native Americans here in this case, Worcester versus Georgia. And Jackson ignores the ruling, and he says if John Marshall makes his decision, go ahead and let him enforce it. The president, by the constitutional structure of things, is actually supposed to be the one who executes or carries out what the law says, what the Supreme Court interprets it as being, but he's not going to have it. And this kind of reflects a bit of the independence and the rule breaking that people see Andrew Jackson doing here, in which he's basically doing his own thing. He's not following the system and the structure and the checks and balances and the interpretation, in this case, of the Supreme Court. And this cartoon kind of reflects how Andrew Jackson, in this particular case, is kind of being his own guy and making his own decisions. And in this case, some would say he's being unconstitutional and breaking the law and acting like a kind of a king. And we'll talk about some of these other factors here that are creating this image of him being and acting like a king, King Andrew I, as a major criticism of him. In 1835, the Treaty of New Echota is signed, and this treaty is signed just a few months before Jackson, no longer president, and the federal government here persuades 500 Cherokee of the 17,000 plus to give away their land. The remaining Cherokee, though, said, "Hey, wait a minute, we weren't there for that, and we don't those 500 don't represent the whole nation. This doesn't have any bearing." But this quite often happened with negotiations with Native Americans, in that the government would sign a treaty with one group, despite the fact that not all of them were there, and the treaty was enforced on everybody. And so this gave Jackson a legal document to actually remove them all, and he sets in motion, basically, the removal of Native Americans from the east into the west to Indian Territory. There's very few people who stand up against it. Webster and Henry Clay will protest this, but there's very little other voices out there standing up for them in this respect. Cherokee's response is that they'll resist until about 1838. President Van Buren will actually start the removal himself and utilize the military to make that happen. The general who's in charge, General John Wool, resigned in protest. His replacement is General Winfield Scott. He'll be a hero in the Mexican-American War coming up. And about 7,000 troops began relocating and organizing and getting into the south and getting into groups and getting them ready to march into the west. Here is Mr. Martin Van Buren. And so once they do that, after a fairly sizable amount of time organizing them into camps and the groups, the United States military by force marches them to their new home, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma, and they cooperate on this march to Oklahoma, the various tribes. And it's very, very difficult. Loss of property. They did own farms in the south. Massive loss of life through disease, exposure to the elements, dying along the way, walking along the way, packing up whatever they had, and dying of starvation, disease, so on and so forth. And these are the routes that they take. Various different routes by boat and by ship and up the rivers and so on and so forth. And it's a very long, arduous task, not made easy whatsoever. It's kind of interesting to know that a good number of them from Florida do not ever leave. And the Native American resistance does continue, though. It isn't said and done with that. The Black Hawk up in Illinois and what is Illinois and parts of Iowa basically left this particular Native American reservation, Indian Territory, and went back to their homeland and home territories back in Illinois. And all of a sudden, when that happens, 4,500 Illinois state militia and federal troops responded. And it results in massive attacks and slaughters of these people, and they are trying to flee for their lives, and they're caught in. Resistance to relocation is especially significant in Florida with the Seminole tribes in the very southern part of Florida. The Seminole led by Chief Osceola. That should be a familiar name, Osceola County. They basically have a strong resistance because of the geography and the terrain there, and they're especially adept at using that geography and terrain, swamps, dense territory and land, hard to find, lots of cover. And there are some escaped slaves from the Deep South who have fled down there, basically assimilated into the Seminole tribes and lived amongst them and were part of this particular resistance. And attacking white settlements through the northern reaches of Florida using guerrilla warfare tactics that you kind of see here, which is the same similar type of tactics we talked about with French-Indian War, also utilized by Americans in the Revolutionary War to a significant degree, especially in the South of that Revolutionary War. And they're able to resist for a long period of time, and they can take that moniker that they've never been completely defeated by the United States government and forced to relocate, and eventually this forced removal will be abandoned by the United States government because of their resistance. But there's a series of Seminole Wars that begin here with the event called the Dade Massacre. That might be familiar to you as well. There's a United States major by the name of Francis Dade, who was in his soldiers, his unit, were attacked by some Seminole fighters, and very few of the entire group actually survive, and it gets the name the Dade Massacre. And the public hears about this, and they become furious. The United States government responds by sending more troops down here into Florida, and it begins what's called the Seminole Wars. And there's a historic state park that you can go see up here as well. And the Seminole Wars lasted into 1842, and 1,500 plus Americans died in this particular series of wars. And the Seminoles are successful in fending off the United States government and complete removal through their guerrilla warfare tactics and hiding in swamps, and eventually the United States government gives up. After the year 1842, there's really very few Native American groups that remain east of our Mississippi River here. That is marked here by with this border, series of borders with these states. Overall, up until this point in time, there's about 100 million acres of land taken from them. $68 million worth of funds given in payment, although not all of it is completely received. And in exchange, 32 million acres of land west of the Mississippi River is given. Eventually, of course, that's going to be taken as well. And the civilized tribes are still there. The heritage, the people, their descendants are still there in Oklahoma in significant numbers. And many of these people actually will also be fighters for the South in the Civil War. If you can imagine, these people are coming from the South. The civilized tribes, good numbers of these farmers also had slaves, interestingly enough, and those slaves did go with them, and they became farmers to some extent here, and they'll be part of the Southern resistance when we get to the Civil War. But they established their own governments in Indian Territory and developed schools and built farms, had their own police force, and basically, again, they are considered to be by the United States government a foreign nation, and the federal government has control and oversight over them, not the states. One of the themes that we had here out of this lesson also, a reinforcement of the role and the position and place of states versus the federal government, according to John Marshall. So this is the wrap on the second lesson here, and consider this cartoon. We'll talk about this cartoon in class. What does it say about the issue of Indian removal? What does it show us about the relationship that is being projected here between Andrew Jackson and Native Americans? And we'll look at a series of documents that help us answer why is it that the Americans supported Indian removal in the 1930s. Good day.